Our webinar is about making podcasts in the classroom, and just excited to be here with y'all. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll let Erin and Laura introduce themselves. So my name is Brenna Stout. I am the representative from Listenwise. I was a former teacher in Las Vegas, Nevada. I taught in CCSD and also in a charter school network. I taught science and social studies, mostly science to multilingual learners. And then before that, I was teaching abroad in Nicaragua to students who were learning English. So that's a little bit of me and my background. And now I'm working with Listenwise. So I'll pop it over to Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin Jewell, and I am a library media specialist, or a librarian. In Louisville ISD, I'm at a middle school in the Colony, Texas, just north of Dallas. So this is my third year as librarian, and before that, I was a classroom teacher for 18 years.
And hi, I'm Laura Krenicki. I'm a global studies teacher in 6th grade in a middle school in Colchester, Connecticut, and this is my 20th year.
All right, thank you all for being here. So excited to be here with you today. Before we get started, I just kind of wanted to go over a quick agenda. So I'll do some introductions. We'll have a quick Listenwise overview. We'll have a discussion about how to develop routines using podcasts. We'll talk about podcasts as sources, and then we'll finish the call off with students creating their own podcast projects. And then at the end, we'll have a little Q&A. As we go through the call today, I like to just norm that you get to show up as you are. So I know as educators, you're wearing 100 hats. So thank you for being here. Stay open and curious to learn. We are all here to learn. I'm very excited to hear from some experts in the field. Honor others' perspectives. We are sharing what we know and what we have seen in our classrooms and in our educational experience. Chat often. Please use the chat a lot. We're going to be asking questions and asking for participation throughout. So we will be in the chat a lot. And then at the end, write down any questions that you have, so we can have an open discussion at the end. All right. Erin, Laura, anything to add here? Nope. Awesome. Okay. So what is Listenwise? Some of you may be familiar with Listenwise and some of you may not. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being I'm an expert and 1 I'm not so sure, could you type into the chat how familiar are you with Listenwise? I'll give you about 30 seconds. So I see we have 4, 3, 2, 5, 4, 0, 3, 4.53. Okay, so we're a little bit all over the board, which is great because that means we all have something that we can share and something that we can learn from each other as well. So what is Listenwise? Listenwise is a resource that teachers can use in their classroom that is grounded in podcasts. So while we want to always be teaching literacy and literacy domains to our students, Listenwise is here to help you with the listening aspect. So all of our lessons have podcasts embedded in them. And within each podcast, there is a transcript that students can listen along with. So they are seeing words and vocabulary as they're listening along. After they listen, there's questions, there's comprehension questions, quick quiz questions, and different activities that teachers can use in their classroom to help students. And we have various collections, different topics, science, social studies, ELA. We have our newest ESL collection, and then a collections category that has various topics. This pairs great with Google Classroom, and so we're going to go more into detail about how you might use these podcasts throughout the call today. So here at the beginning of, before we are able to teach students how to create their own podcasts, we want to start our discussion off with creating some routines with podcasts in there. So I've taken this and I've kind of broken it down into 2 different types of learning, asynchronous and synchronous. Sometimes you can use these lessons one-on-one with or students can do them independently, or we can have a whole class listen. And some of the asynchronous lessons include independent listening, where students are just learning on their own. You can have a bell ringer activity where students are learning on their own as well, where they are listening on their own device in their own space and then answering questions. We could have a writing activity after a listening, so students are practicing those listening skills and then doing a writing activity with some questions, or maybe they're filling in the blanks to fill in the writing activity. On the other side, we have a synchronous lesson where students are doing this full class all together. And these can be the whole class listens where there's 3 listens. This is more focused on our ELD lesson library, where the students are listening the first time through, the second time through, and the third time through. This could be done through debate. So you could have students practice the listening and then offer sides for debate. Or speaking after a listening activity where students are turning and talking, they're doing a think, pair, share, something to get them having a discussion. And then in the middle here, I put the asynchronous and synchronous lessons that can be a little bit of both or either or. So if you're here to build background knowledge with podcasts, maybe students can listen on their own once, and then as a whole class, you can listen again. So they're able to maybe watch some of the videos together or individually, or it can be done as a station rotation where maybe you listen whole class and then they go into a station and listen further. So I would love for you all to add into the chat, how are you using Listenwise in your routines right now? I'll give us 1 minute in your classroom routines, or if you're not, how might you see this being done? Okay, I'm seeing some different answers coming in through the chat. A little bit of every way, in and out of the classroom, help teachers and coaches, reflections, station rotations, listening discussions. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for adding into the chat, and definitely going to have to go see how some other teachers are using this in their classroom.
And one person asked how long most of them are. Most of them are in the 5-minute range. There's some that are 30 seconds, like super short, and there's some that can get to the 7 to 10, but most 5's about normal.
Thanks, Erin. Now, as we think about these routines, these can be thrown into your classrooms in any different ways. So I went ahead and made a weekly example. This is totally just an example of different ways that you might be using this in your classroom. So, and I'm speaking of my experience, how I use podcasts throughout my classroom. But like I said, I taught science and social studies for English learners. So on Mondays, you could do a building a background activity or an SEL activity where when students come into the classroom, they're doing a Listenwise activity and then they're doing a quick writing activity afterwards. The next part of the day, you could build a vocabulary lesson out. So maybe they're drawing and building a flip book or making something fun to practice those vocabulary words. And then your exit out of the classroom is practicing with those words. On Tuesday, it could be all about notes. And you have a bell ringer activity with building off the vocabulary from before. You have guided notes over the topic. And then at the end of class, they're doing one of those short Listenwise activities and answering the Google Classroom quiz. Wednesday could be all about stations. So you could start the class off with a think, pair, share. Then in a station rotation, they could have one listening activity as part of their literacy, or the one station could be listening. The next station could be answering the questions, talking, and so on. And then your exit ticket could be your question. Thursdays were always creative days in my classrooms, especially in science and social studies. We were always building and creating something. So one activity for a creative Thursday could be watching a video and then having a debate over a Listenwise topic. My favorite lesson was the debate topics with step up, step down. So students could have their point of view, they could step up to the line, state their point of view, whether they agreed or disagreed, and step back. It gets all the students talking in the classroom. And then your exit could be writing your stance. Okay, where do you actually stand after hearing everyone's ideas? Friday is always show what you learned this week. At the beginning, you could have a Listenwise activity paired with speaking. And then through the middle of class could be an assessment of some sort of show what you learned that week. And Fridays, I always like to end class on gratitude statements. So students are really building community within their classroom. So this is just a prime example of what some different ways where you might be able to plug in a Listenwise podcast lesson throughout your week. Now you may be wondering, well, what are some more specific lessons that you might be able to do? And Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually appreciate the comments that are coming up in the chat. And it was Kimberly and David have some that I was actually thinking about. So you'll see on here as a transition or as a bell ringer, we often will use some of the podcasts, especially the weird news ones. I don't know if you are familiar with the weird news ones. There's 146 weird news stories. They're all about 30 seconds, so they're super short. And we ask students in the morning to come in and pick a weird news story that they can do a turn and talk and tell their friends about. And then on here, you'll see this is a Jamboard. We actually had kids then tell us on a scale of 1 to 5, they would recommend that particular weird news story. But it doesn't have to be the weird news. It could absolutely be the current events. There's a whole section of current event stories, as well as debate topics. So I think you can filter those out to see if there was one that maybe you can have students and take both sides of a debate and use that as your bell ringer or as your routine in your classroom. Okay, so I'm going to pick up on here. So I did want to mention that, and I don't know if this is true of your own students, maybe you can jump in the chat on this, that I teach 6th grade. This is the first year of middle school for my students. And we find that students score low in speaking and listening and in inference. It's just traditionally they come in low in those strands. So that's actually an area that we try to focus on with students. And we also try to look, I know Edel mentioned this, that I don't know the gender, is using them for text sets. And that's another thing that we tend to do with Listenwise. We'll pull different types of text and different types of modalities of text so that students are exposed to different versions of the story. And I show in the very top corner here, starting off early in our year, we talk about how objects can tell our stories and our personal histories. And there's a particular story, it was about 7 or 8 years ago now, about this time capsule that was found in Boston. It was a colonial era time capsule found in the building. And we connect that podcast to some other things locally in our community. We found a missing time capsule in our own community, and we look to see what kinds of objects people leave behind to tell a story of their past. So the time capsule podcast is only 2 minutes, which is fantastic. It's not too overwhelming, but there's so much information in there. They go through every object that's in the time capsule. But then we'll say, do you think that this 2-minute story is the only story? Do you think we could find more information? So then we start learning how to be a researcher and look at other types of text. So I have some examples on there. The history website has it. The Fine Art Museum in Boston actually facilitated the opening of this time capsule. So of course they would have a story on it. And then we use Newsella, which I know many teachers are using because it levels the Lexile reading level for them. So using a podcast as a starting point is a great way of introducing other types of text. In addition to that, there are some really fantastic stories on here that connect to, in my class, Global Studies. You'll see on the side, on the right, I have 2 that are big topics in our course. One is about why people become refugees. And of course, every year there's a new story about another refugee crisis. But middle school students especially are also really passionate about social justice, the global goals, and the climate. So I am really happy that Listenwise has been trying to really put more of those types of resources on there for podcasting. And I have on the right side of, if you notice, students get really excited about some of these topics, then they may take a hand at podcasting themselves. I know we're going to get into this a little bit more in our session today, but I do know that there's some like contests out there for videos and podcasts, and students are like, wait, what I say can really make a difference. And so learning how to, what it is that podcasters do and how the different voices are important in a podcast, and then translating that into a final product. It's a little bit of work, but I'll tell you, the kids are really passionate about that. And then seeing that there's a real world application in another audience outside of the classroom is really empowering. And I did put down here 2 different versions of podcasting platforms that are really free and easy to use with students. If you've used Flip before, or it used to be called Flipgrid, they changed their name this year, but Flip is actually a video creation platform, but of course you can absolutely use it for podcasting, just do voice only. And Anchor FM, is it Anchor.fm it may be, they're a division of Spotify, and we've actually had students create, we had whole class like stories that we've created and made podcasts with the entire class. And then they can see that their work is published online. I know there's other sorts, like Canva as well, now allows podcasting, and kids can design their, their logo for their podcast. So it's really empowering for students, not only to like learn how to do it well, and I think Listenwise is really great for curating those really high quality sources. And then they can take a lesson from that and then turn around and create their own. Oh yes, you like Anchor FM too. Yeah, and it's so easy. I'm so happy. It's something middle school friendly that they can figure out how to use. I know that was a lot all at once. Yeah, it's super easy, isn't it, Ashley, to use Anchor? And speaking of challenges.
Right. So there's the Student Podcast Challenge. And if you haven't been there before, NPR has a ton of resources. They have podcast prompts for the contest, but you don't have to enter the contest to still use these really nice prompts. They have a student guide that can either be like a student can take it and do it completely independently, or it can be teacher driven too. They have interview tips, they have scripting guides. I think that's one of the things that kids don't think about, that there is a script with a podcast. And it's really thought out the beginning, middle, and end of that story. And then there's also a link for all the past winners. One of my former coworkers, her kid was actually one of the ones that won the middle school last year, and that was in Texas. So that's a really great source. And they have a lot of different podcasts linked in there as well. One of the things also, whenever we're talking about podcasting, is that for the most part, I find that adults are the main consumer of podcast. Kids listen to podcasts because we tell them to. There aren't a lot of kids that do listen to podcasts on their own. There are some, but for the most part, we need to build that background knowledge of what a podcast is before we can expect them to create their own. So that's one of my main things whenever I'm teaching teachers about podcasting is like, you can't have them do a project without having them really dive in and like look at what all these podcasts do. So some of these questions, I just put them on the screen. So I'll like, okay, guys, let's talk about podcasts today. So what are they about? Where can you hear them? Where might you listen to a podcast? What's different between podcasting and YouTubers? Because that YouTube is still a huge thing. Both of my children believe they're going to be YouTubers. They might be. And then thinking about that audio only, and like, how do things change when we talk on the phone? How do things change when we don't have that video cue? And just getting them thinking about that listening skill. And there's some really great discussion that happens. Just, it can be small group and then we bring it to the whole class, or even just things to think about.
I'm curious, Erin, what are some of the answers that you've gotten from students when they have asked, when you have asked them like what they notice in the visual of YouTube versus just listening?
I mean, we're so visual. Most of my students don't talk on the phone. They FaceTime for everything. So it's really weird to remove the video. I mean, even right now, like the panelists right now, we're communicating with video. So when you take that video portion away, you really have to think about how you describe things and how you, it's just different. A lot of them talk to, when they talk to their grandparents, that's whenever they talk on the phone without video. Some of them still, some of their grandparents FaceTime and they're super fancy, but a lot of them, that's what they mention. And a lot of them talked about like a lot of podcasts are recorded too. So I'm like, yep, that's true. A lot of my favorite ones have been, there's a YouTube version of it as well.
And Laura, in your classroom, do your students share what kind of podcasts that they listen to as sixth graders?
They do. And what was surprising to me, well, maybe not so surprising, they really like true crime, and they're sixth grade. They're really into those. But then there's some other ones that are done by kids, and they enjoy the ones that are done by kids. And those are ones that they choose to listen to on their own. One thing I wanted to mention about this too, and when our pre-discussion, it kind of came up too, we have some students who are really reluctant and really shy and don't want to share. And sometimes those are the kids that end up becoming like the Foley artists, or they're the ones that are the producers that, really have figured out how to run the technology, and they're not the ones that want to do the speaking, or they may be really good at editing scripts. And it's nice to see that kind of collaboration, so everybody feels included, even if they don't end up having their voices on their podcast.
And I have one more question for you, Erin, on this topic. As you've used podcasts before you've done this project, are students more familiar with what podcasts are and like the difference in voices and tones if they've listened to some podcasts before doing the project?
Most of my students really talk about how their parents listen to podcasts. That's really, they're like, oh yeah, my mom listens to those. My dad listens to those. Or that's what we listen to in the car, that kind of thing. So I don't think I think they do hear the tone and the difference and how it sounds different, but I don't know if they could define that without a little prodding.
So maybe having podcasts in their routines before the project would be helpful.
Funny how you did that. This is also something, so these two slides are going to have the same information, just in a different format. So I would use this. I actually developed this one when we were at home and kids were listening to podcasts as part of our at-home routine. And all of those were text boxes. So they could put in the podcast. They had a choice between like, I think I curated about 10 different ones on a different topic from Listenwise. And then they were looking at what the story's question was, anything else you wanted to share about it, what's the story about and what's the story not about. That's a big thing that NPR uses as their guiding questions. And that's what we did every single time we listened to something. What's it about? What's it not about? So even if I thought about like the time capsule, like it's about the objects, but what's it not about? It's not about the people. It's not about the, like, so just kind of thinking about what's left out of the story. How do they engage the audience or hold them, or do they? Like some of the podcasts are kind of boring. So like we can call them out for that. And some of our student podcasts that they create, they leave out those details. And then what's the audience going to remember when it's over? And then I had those little things, getting them to start cueing in on those sounds. So what sounds do we hear? Do we hear a host? Is there someone that is like an NPR host that tells what's going on? Is there an interview that happens in the story? Is it a person that interviews, or like the reporter? Or is it a person telling the story? A lot of those true crime ones have an interview element with it. Is there audio from the events? So there was one that had like a crash or something. So you hear the crash, you hear all the details. Is there audio from movies or TV? Is there background noise? Not just like chatter that we have going on in the background, but is there some kind of like nature sound or something else that's going on? And with my student, whenever they were creating them, they had to credit their sources. When we were doing our, like, we did a informational one about different controversial topics. It wasn't a debate, but they still had to credit where they found all the information. So according to Pew Research, and then they could say that, so how did they cue in where they got their information and not that they made it up? And the next slide is the exact same thing, but I turned it into doodle notes. So if you can click, it's the exact same stuff, just less detail. It's still the sounds that they hear. I would print something like this out. What's the story? What's not the story? How do they engage the audience? How are you going to remember the story? So it's the main information from the other side. Same amount of writing, just a different method of doing it.
And Erin, one question I have for you on this is, as you are working with multilingual learners, when you ask this question, what's the story not about, or what do you hear? How is that helping or supporting your multilingual learners?
That's a little tricky for me because when in the classroom, I didn't have as many. My campus now, I have a ton of multilingual learners. But I would think that trying them to get to the main idea, that's a main, like, that's a, like, I worked a lot with my ASL classes as a librarian, and like trying to listen to it multiple times and being able to tell what the story that they just heard was about. I think they might get a little confused of what it's not about at the very beginning. But I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a skill that they can practice. Laura, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I want to jump in a little bit on what Erin was talking about when you talk about the background sounds. I think sometimes just having the transcript, especially for our ELL learners, we want them to be able to know really what's being said, especially if there are many voices and lots of accents. It can make it really challenging to kind of differentiate who is the speaker and who's telling the story. And one of the examples I like for this one is the story that's the insight into the refugee experience. And it was done, I always love this one. It was done by well, it's a simulation, let me back up a little bit, that was put together by Doctors Without Borders. And I guess it was a moving exhibit that went around the country pre-COVID. And people can go, and then they go through the simulation of what it feels like to be a refugee. And just if you read the transcript, you really don't get the nuance of how the people going through the simulation are really feeling. You do hear a lot more sound. There are more voices that are not put in the transcript, but also the tone of voice. You could definitely hear that the people going through the simulation were feeling like they were really going through it. And the kids were like, oh, that's funny. I didn't get that when I read it. So it's important to kind of stop and pause in those teachable moments to be like, okay, so how did that tell you more about the story just by hearing her voice? And I think that's a power of listening.
This is how I would like kind of, when we're doing those listening activities with the whole class, this is what it might look like. So this is from the podcast Kind World, and this is about the So chocolate bar. Kind of gives a little like hint that this is going to be an interview. And then what's telling the story, and then what's the story, what's not the story. Do you like it? Who did the talking? Who did you hear talking in it? What sorts of sounds did you hear besides the interviews? And how does it incorporate a passion? Because my students, when we were doing our own individual podcast, they had to do it about a passion. So I tried to show how different people were exploring their passions. And that's so besides just the questions that are in Listenwise, but showing just a little bit more.
Erin, what were some of their passions that they decided on?
if you name it, they have done it. I think some of my favorites, I had a swimmer, and she really looked into her interview. She interviewed, so they had to interview someone or find an interview of someone talking about it. And she interviewed the Texas like swim coach for the University of Texas. And her question was that I'm short. Can I be a swimmer? And one of her swimmers wrote back. She was like, I'm also short and I'm a swimmer for the University of Texas. So that was a really cool one. I had one that she did it on film, but she did it all through the lens of Batman because she was obsessed. These are sixth graders. So just, it's so quirky, like to see dance, cooking, Legos, a lot of engineering. They're like, well, I like Legos. I'm like, well, what can we do with Legos besides just build? So like engineering and all of that. So there were some really, I think probably the most specific was I had a girl that hers was all about like farming. I guess in the summers, she lives with her grandparents and they farm. And so she had all of this environmentalism, and it was really neat.
It really goes to show that podcasts can really be on any topic. But I have to say I'm partial to the swimmer because I was a swimmer in college and I am also very short. So thanks for sharing.
And then this is when we kind of transition from the listening and planning to getting into like, what's my podcast and how am I going to share my story? So what's my story's question? What's the story about? What's it not about? And like pulling those same things that we practiced the whole way through back in here. How will I ensure my story is fair to the people and ideas it represents? So like if I'm doing an interview, how am I going to make sure that it's fair and it's not making fun of people or anything like that? How am I going to engage my audience and make sure that they're going to be interested in my story and want to listen from beginning to end? How are they going to remember when it remember it, and then when it's over, how are they going to like, oh yeah, that was that podcast about? So like the filmmaker, when she threw Batman in with it, I mean, she's a sophomore in college now, and I still remember what she did on, I mean, because it's just something that stuck with me. So that's a lot of that when we start doing the planning, using a lot of those same skills we did with listening.
Laura, I know that you said you have done some similar projects. Do any of the projects that your students have done come to mind?
I had to unmute. Yes. So we have the students work on developing podcasts for our Genius Hour, or for SEL. We have now, or like an advisory period now. It's not exactly the same way as it was during COVID, but we give students a choice if they want to come back and do podcasting with us. So we now, since we train the kids in sixth grade to do it, the kids who are now seventh and eighth graders who have moved on have the opportunity to come back and do some projects with us. Some of them decide that they're going to kind of extend the learning that they started before. And some have now realized that they have a shift of focus. I think now that when they get a little bit older, they start to understand bigger concepts in the world that make it that their earlier information may have been very one-sided. And so now they have a bigger worldview and now may look at things a little bit more differently. So kids find that if they have a voice and they can make some change, that this is an excellent way of reaching an audience that's beyond our school sometimes. And they also, because there's so many contests and opportunities like that too, they're not only creating them for themselves, for the greater community, but now they have maybe some monetary incentive in order to enter their podcasts in some contests. I think that that's kind of like the golden ticket for those who think, you know what, I think my idea is really powerful and maybe other people will think so too.
And then this last one also is, again, once we get into that planning stage, how are we going to pay attention to voice, the structure of it, that beginning, middle, and end, the sounds, You can't tell, I really hone in on the sounds. And then crediting sources, because again, if we're doing a research element with it, you have to say where you got your information from. And it makes it credible. Like if we're just saying information without saying where it came from, I mean, that's a really big information skill that we need our kids to know.
You both mentioned crediting sources. Laura, in your crediting sources, what is something that you have found that they really have to focus on, or kind of what's the top thing that you have to be like, this is different, or this is how you find a source, or what's like the top thing that you have to emphasize on crediting?
So I have two strands for this. So because sixth graders don't know how to do research well, I actually curate on Wakelet. I curate quite a few sources of material, or maybe a database or encyclopedias. I have them all already curated, and all the students have to start there. And so once they find some sources, like primary sources that will, or some sources that will really help them with their research, we also then teach the skill of annotating and for citing sources. So we in our district, we use Noodle tools, and some may be familiar with this and some may not be, but it's a citation tool that allows kids to take to properly cite their sources and to take notes and reword them in their own words. They end up using it all the way through the rest of their academic career in our district. So we're kind of like skill-based really in sixth grade. And I'm sure Erin is the same way as the media specialist. I'm sure that's what you're focused on too, is making sure students know how to do that. But because they have never really had to find credible sources on their own, it's really guided in the beginning. But then because the topics end up being quite personal to them, we'll end up sitting down together and say, okay, so what is it you need to know? And how do we know that this is going to be a source that is useful for you? It can be a challenge, especially with the way, Google is an easy search tool, but it doesn't necessarily, reveal the best search results. So
Absolutely.
getting them in that mindset of being researchers is a challenge for sixth grade.
And I think piggybacking on that is that my students, so I did podcasts with both sixth graders and eighth graders, and they were so used to using MLA format, they didn't know how to informally say Brian Johnson of NPR said blah blah blah. So like kind of breaking them of that very formal. So we still had that. We're excited at the end where all of the sources came from, but how do no, but who said it? Like just get real, like listen to these podcasts. Nobody goes in and says like on this website on the third page, like nobody says that. So we want to give like informal credits as much as those formal, like they need to know how to do that MLA citation, but they also need to just tell you where they got the information.
Yeah, I remember in my classroom, I taught 4th through 8th grade students, and oftentimes they would, especially students who are using Google, would be like, put their site source as Google, and it's because it's the top one and they choose it. So really teaching them to be researchers in that process became very important. But then it also allowed them, as they were searching for other content, to be like, wait, is this true or not true? Especially in their own free time. It's a big topic in 5th grade. What is real and not real on the internet? All right, so that brings us to some questions. So feel free to type into the chat what questions you might have. If they're specific to one of us, please put our name in the beginning. And yeah, we are here to have a conversation about building podcasts, putting podcasts as routines, using podcasts with your multilingual learners, any questions that you might have at this time. And I'm going to go back and chat. Oh, we have one question. What size groups work well to make podcasts? Oh, I will let Laura and Aaron answer that question.
I had a lot of success doing it with partners, especially when they were doing research. So one time they were researching a controversial topic and they picked the two sides. So one of them kind of navigated the one side and the other one navigated the other side. So that was, I think once you get too many voices involved, it gets real. It's also great as an individual project. That's gonna, like if I was gonna pick a way to do a podcast, yeah. Thank you, Ashley, for
So
coming.
yeah, I agree. 2 people is good. 3 people is probably okay. I wouldn't go more than 3 unless we did a whole class one and everybody had a scripted thing that they had to say. So they were very, it was interesting to see how careful everyone was being because they didn't want to miss their cues. And they also wanted to make sure that they were supporting their classmates. So everybody's voice could be heard. We did that at the end of the year though. So we had a lot of practice already. So that was kind of a fun thing. And I did see somebody was asking about the equipment we use. So I actually, regular, if kids have Chromebooks or iPads, the regular microphones are pretty good, but when you have a whole class doing it, it's really difficult to differentiate the voices. So we actually purchased some Sennheiser like professional headphones with the noise canceling mics. That has made a huge difference. I know it's a lot of money and I apologize for that, but it's worth the investment. Like I didn't get any books or anything from my students just so we could get a class set of podcasting headphones with microphones. And then when we did the whole big group, we used one of the boom like microphones for that.
Equipment also, I got a grant and I have, they're over here. They're from HP and they're the big headphones. I think if nothing else, like some other little tricks that we did, recording in a closet because it takes all of like all the clothes in there really helps with the sound, or talking to a wall, as silly as it sounds. Like, so if my students had their Chromebook or iPad, if you talk to a wall, the sound bounces back a little bit. And then with the iPads, I always have my kids take it out of the case very carefully, take it out of the case, because where the case is, it mutes the microphone just a little bit. So if you just pay attention and play around with it. With the iPads also, if you record in GarageBand, there is a podcasting tool in GarageBand that you can just Google how to do that. And it's got some really great, it'll cancel out some of the sounds. I really also think it's more about the planning and the script than it is about the recording.
100%. And I think that it absolutely answers Kimberly's question about 10th grade students. The making of the podcast itself, that's the easy part. It's the actual writing of the script, that and the research. And so I wouldn't skimp on the time as much as you think, okay, maybe we can do it in a week. It could take 2. It really could take longer than that. Even if the podcast is quite short, you want it to have high quality research in it for it to be, you don't want students to rush through the process of the script writing and think about the tone and all that stuff. The actual podcast itself, creating, like sitting down with the recording equipment, once you get past the first few takes are going to be terrible, but once you get through those first few takes, then they get the hang of it and it flows much easier. But the actual script writing, I 100% agree, it takes much more time.
I would also say that kids need, just as much as they need practice listening, they need practice speaking their answers and recording it. I came from a gifted and talented background, so I had a lot of little perfectionists. You have them in every room, but the GT room, there's a lot of them. So having them practice and like, you have 10 minutes to record this right now. They're like, what? Yeah, you have 10 minutes. So you have as many tries as you need in 10 minutes, spreading them along the hallway. I mean, I would, while I was a classroom teacher, I would make a deal with the librarian to reserve like corners of the library also, so that we had other places where I could have quiet spots. Just getting creative. And yes, I love adding like the production afterwards. Like it can be really fun.
Under stairwells are other really good places, like where stairs like cross over that little like section underneath. Those are awesome.
Yes, they
Yes.
can edit in GarageBand as well.
I really like how you all have found the best spots for recording and being very creative in those. I also really like how the podcast, yeah, they can add jingles and music. It really allows their creativity as well as, getting to be creative in their research.
There are some really great practice ones too with the prompts in International Podcast Day. That's in September, I believe. And yeah, it was just a few weeks ago. That having them just talk and do like a 6-word memoir and then explain it just a second, like that can be a really great practice thing for podcasting. Just taking like a tiny little topic. So tell me about the best meal you ever had, who made it, and who was with you when you had it. And they just kind of give that little story and they're just giving that practice.
Have you all in your classrooms, I know something that I did in my classroom is we gave presentations, and sometimes it was in front of the class or recorded or in podcast form, and you could see the growth of the students, how they progressed in those skills along the way. Have you all done something like that where you've seen growth? And if so, what's something that you really have seen growth in as they practice these skills throughout the year?
This is a tricky one.
It, it is, but I mean, the more they talk, it's just like, I mean, I'm not nervous talking right now because I talk all the time. And, we all had a couple years of talking on screens. The first time I did something like I get real nervous. It's the same thing with kids. Also, someone just asked about grading. Yeah, I always grade things with a rubric, and I graded more of the process than the product.
Mhm.
The product was always like icing on the cake. I never faulted a kid that um, wasn't comfortable talking. It was all about, did they do the research? Did they do all of that? That's where like I used a lot of above and beyond points, and it came from that. Also, when you were talking, I also did like photo stories sometimes instead of, so they would incorporate pictures and narrate them. So there's a bunch of different apps you can use. So you can use the Adobe videos or Canva. You can record in there too. You can just do it like Apple Clips too, that you can just do the pictures and narrate over them. And that's how they can do a podcast that's, just taking it to the next level.
The other thing you might want to think about if you want to see progress over time is if students create like a digital portfolio of their work. You can do that. I know if they're doing it through Flip keeps all their videos for them, so you can see their progress over time. But Wakelet or Padlet is another way of sharing, like go through your whole collection and share your very best one, and have students take ownership of what they want to put out there. I agree with Erin as far as grading the student podcast. There's no final, like, I shouldn't say there's no final grade. Of course there is, but it's really the podcast is a summative piece, and all the formative pieces are the more important things. So how did we work on doing the story? How did we work on doing the research? So all of that should have been assessed along the way. And then the podcast at the end, it could be a summative assessment, and it could be a rubric that you use to make sure they hit certain elements. But yeah, I wouldn't make it a high stakes. The final result is not a high stakes thing, because some students, of course, are going to be better at that than others. And so it's really the process that we really want to make sure that they're getting that information.
Okay, I have one last question for both of you ladies. As you have created these podcasts, have students listened to each other's podcasts? And if so, how did that go?
I had students create a website, and we had a whole collection of our whole thing. So I've done it a couple different ways. One time it was the true website, and then another time we just kind of hacked it and did it in Canvas. That's our LMS. And they had a slide that had a link to their podcast. It had a picture that went along with it, had their topic, had a link to their Works Cited so that people could research more. So yeah, and we just kind of explored it more like science fair style than here, let everyone sit and awkwardly listen to a podcast right now, because that just, you can also do like a tic-tac-toe or like a bingo kind of board with it so that you're listening to 5 podcasts, but you might not. I'm just not a fan of like, let's all just like awkwardly stare at a person when they push play.
The other, it's been harder since COVID, but the way we used to set it up too is that each student would have a Chromebook or device in the room. We'd have them have it all queued up, ready to go. And then we actually teach how to peer review. And we have certain points of how to peer review each other's work, which is based on the rubric. You know, it should have this, this, and this. And then we give like a 0, 1, 2 scoring thing on it. So if a person covered all the points in the rubric, they got a 2. If they got a 1, what could have been done maybe to clarify, maybe something wasn't clear, what advice would you give in a kind way, in a productive way, not saying what was a deficit, but what was a positive. And if the element wasn't even there, then of course then it would have a 0. But we would have it set up so that this one review sheet would be set up next to the device, and we would spend 3 or 4 minutes at each station, and then we would give them time to listen and write it down. Headphones on, nobody's speaking, they're just listening. And then we'd move to another location. So by the end of the class period, they would have 4 or 5 peer reviews all in one sheet so that then they could go back and use that to refine their work.
That's a great idea. As you both were talking, I'm curious to think about how social media and kids being plugged in and making their own videos online has influenced like how they show up in the classroom in these ways. Because I know when I was in school, nobody was watching me on the internet, but now with the rich media, they might be a little more brave in that space.
Hey guys,
yeah.
check this out.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming.